So I will also have my presentation in English. My Polish is very limited, actually. I learned only 2 words today. One is dziękuję, the other one is open source, and I'm only sure of the pronunciation of the second one. So we heard over the last 2 decades or so many interesting stories and arguments on why public administration should use public administration and also private companies should use open source. We heard that it can help you to avoid vendor lock-in. It can help you to build efficiently and fast solutions which can be shared and reused. However, today I would like to tell you a different story from the point of view of the European Commission. So why is it important to use open source from the point of view of the European Union, and what are the tools which the European Commission provides to facilitate the reuse? So why is open source important, and why is it recommended for public administrations? The digital agenda is one of the 7 flagships identified in the I-2020 European strategy, which aims at solving the economic crisis and preparing the European economy to the challenges of the next decade. The digital agenda argues that the ICT and the internet is one of the tools which has the potential to provide solutions to reach digital single market. However, although citizens and businesses use digital technologies daily, there are still serious issues and challenges when using these technologies. Just think about privacy issues, security concerns, or fragmented market when you're buying books or MP3s or videos in Europe. We still have fragmented markets. Sometimes you still cannot download books or MP3s or films just because you live in a specific area of Europe. The digital agenda for Europe aims to solve these challenges, and it has identified a number of obstacles. Today I would just like to highlight one obstacle. It is the lack of interoperability between systems. So the argument is that there is a need for better administrative coordination between public administrations and a better procurement to be able to provide better applications which are interoperable and based on open standards and open platforms. Let me highlight another framework. European framework is the European Interoperability Framework, which is basically a set of recommendations for public administrations on how to develop public services. And there is one principle which is called reuse and sharing, which argues that public administrations, when developing public services, they should develop them in a way to make them capable of to be reused and shared by other administrations. So if you read all these words, interoperability, better administrative coordination or collaboration, reuse, sharing, open platforms, you can associate to the use of open source, although none of the policies and neither the European framework or the digital agenda has the word open source in it. But in order to achieve all this collaboration and sharing and reusing, open source is a very good tool. In fact, open source from the very beginning was conceived by and born by collaborating and reusing and sharing solutions. Open source is also very good when testing whether a standard is truly open. If you can implement it in open source, most probably it's a real open standard. Let me have just a slide about what are the barriers to sharing and reuse of open source software. In 2010, there was a study made for the European Commission which identified 18, 19 different obstacles. A couple of those you can see on this slide. One of the most important ones were the language barrier. It's very hard to reuse open source solutions when there's no documentation on your language, on the features and the specifications. there was a lack of information on standards and specifications implemented by open source software. It's very hard to find good open source solutions because there are so many, and because the information is limited on them. There is a limited view of public administration's usage of accessing FOSS solutions. It's very hard to find good case studies. And basically, and features are not well documented. This all comes from the fact that most of the times for public administrations, these applications are developed and tailored for the need of one public administration, and the developers are not making money out of selling licenses of this software. So the documentation is not made in a view of sharing and reusing these solutions. Now, after having discussed what are the barriers, I want to highlight a couple of tools and solutions with which the European Commission facilitates the use of open source. We have different levels. On the top level, we have I don't know how I can do this. I will not try. On the top level, you have a framework, the European Interoperability Framework I already mentioned, and the NIFO. I will talk about this in the next slide. On the next level, you have some guidance. We have prepared guidelines for public administrations, likewise, and developers as well. And we also provide a license wizard and some ad hoc expert advices. On the lowest level, we have a number of tools and services to help public administrations develop and share the solutions. And all these are funded by the ISA work program. It stands for Interoperability Solutions for European Public Administrations. The aim of this program is to foster the development of services and tools which are generic, which are common, which can be reused on a European level, and which can provide cross-border services for citizens and businesses, and also for other administrations. It's a 6-year-old program and with a budget of 160 million. So, what is the link between open source software and the European Interoperability Framework? Well, there is no direct link. So there's no policy on the European level which deals with the use of open source. However, in this European Interoperability Framework, as I mentioned, there's a recommendation, it's number 7, which is about sharing and reusing. So it doesn't mention any open source license, doesn't mention the word open source, but it recommends that all these solutions, when you're providing public services, digital public services, they should be reused and shared with other public administrations. It's only a set of recommendations, so there's no requirement. However, it has been decided that the member states should align their national interoperability frameworks to the recommendations of the European Interoperability Framework and come up with legislations, national legislations, which take into account the principles of the European Interoperability Framework. Now, of course, even before the EIF was conceived in 2010, the second version of the EIF, there were a number of national examples which dealt with the use of open source. I will just highlight 3 of them. There are many. You already heard it from the presentation beforehand that there are 350 or so around the world. One good example is the Spanish Royal Decree in the 2010, which explicitly mentions the use of open source when developing public administrations, or at least to consider using open source. It requires public administrations to look for open source solutions already available in national and local repositories. There's an obligatory sharing, which is similar actually to the case in Italy. They also mention the European Union public license, which I will talk about a bit later. It's an open source license. And also, for example, the Malta directive, it mentions explicitly that public administration should go to the European join-up repository and look for available solutions there. The alignment of these national interoperability frameworks are monitored by the NIFO, the National Interoperability Framework Observatory. This is an action funded by this program that I talked to you before, the ISA program. And it helps public administrations to measure how well they are aligned to the principles on the European level, and it helps them during the course to have a better alignment. Now, going down a bit more practical, so that was a bit too high level, but we also provide very useful guidelines, also both for public administrations and also for developers who want to work with public administrations. We have guidelines on how to choose licenses, what is the relation between open source and patents in Europe, although in Europe you cannot patent software solutions, but still there are many questions, and we have a guideline to deal with these. How public administrations can work with open source developers, how and when you can migrate to open source, what are the steps that you should take when you want to migrate to an open source solution. And there is a very interesting guideline on how to procure open source, how to make sure that when you're having an open call for tender, you provide a level playing ground both for proprietary solutions and open source solutions. This can be found on JoinUp. You will have a presentation in one of the tracks. There is another one, another guidance. It's a license wizard. It's available on JoinUp, which helps public administrations to choose the right license. There are many questions among administrations which license they can choose. And this tries to help them by asking a number of questions, whether you want your solution, for example, to be reused commercially or not, whether you're using components which already under a specific set of licenses, and so on and so forth. And at last but not least, we have an expert, a legal expert on JoinUp, who can provide ad hoc advices for you. So if you have any questions on legal issues, what license I should choose, whether licenses are compatible with each other, whether I can further develop a derivative of a work, just go to JoinUp, send a message, and then we have a person who can help you. Now, this is just one slide. On JoinUp, you will have a full presentation later on, but just a couple of words. So what is JoinUp? JoinUp is a repository, an observatory, and also a collaborative environment. So it's basically a website which aims to help public administrations to develop, share, and reuse open source software. How is it different from all the myriads of other repositories out there, and why the Commission started to develop their own? It's a bit different. So while you have SourceForge, Google Code, and also the national repositories, the repositories which like SourceForge or Google Code, they don't focus, I hope it still works, they don't focus on one set of open source. So they have, for example, SourceForge, they have 100,000 open source solutions. JoinUp only has 2,500, but all of them are tailored to be used by public administrations. So for public administrations, it's really interesting to go to JoinUp because they will only see software which are especially made for public administrations. For example, you can find one of my favorite, you can find an application to manage cemeteries. You know, if you go to Google Play or the App Store, you will not find this kind of application. So it can be interesting for public administrations to go. And as I said, it has around 2,500 applications. But it also collects guidelines, as you saw. It also collects news items, best practices around the use of open source. Another tool that we already developed, but we are further developing right now, is the Federation of Open Source Software. So as you can see, in Europe, there are already, I think, 12 repositories, yes, 12 repositories which we already federated. These are national, local repositories which collect open source software made for public administrations. We collected these, we federated them, we translated them, and we provide a central search that you can use. However, it's very limited. You can only see the name of the solution, a very short description, and the link to the repository. So it's very hard to find and to filter your searches. And it's also based on a proprietary solution. So, beginning of this year, we started a new action to enhance this federation, we called for a multidisciplinary working group. We have 41 people in this group. A number of member states were represented. We have standardization bodies, and they came up with an open specification to provide much more information on the federated software. Basically, it's a specification to describe a software. And we have opened the specification for public review. You can see it with a link, and you're invited to read the specification and to give your comments and feedback. Another tool that we provide is the European Union public license. So a bit of history about why the Commission developed yet another license. As you know, license proliferation is a big problem. You have over 200 licenses. Experts warn everyone not to develop your own licenses, just use one of the already available ones. So why did the Commission again went out and developed their own? The easy answer is because, of course, we always have to develop something that we can use for ourselves, but in this case, it was not the case. The Commission needed something which was tailored to the European legislation, and at that time, in 2006, it found that none of the licenses were good enough for its use. So it developed this new license, which has a preference to be used for public administrations, but of course it can be used by anyone. It's unique in a number of ways. It's available in 22 languages. These are not simply translations, but we had lawyers, legal experts to check and to tailor the license in each of the languages to make sure that it's in line with the national legislation. It is drafted to work under European law. We have a warranty and liability which is tailored to the European legislation. And it's very interesting that it has a compatibility list which allows you to distribute a larger work under a selection of other licenses. So for example, you're not logged in EUPL. If you use EUPL for your work and later you want to implement or combine it with some other work, there is a list of other licenses which we consider that in principle they are compatible with the EUPL. So you can switch, for example, to GPL number 2, version 2. What is the impact so far? As I said, the EUPL was never meant to replace big licenses such as GPL version 2 or 3. However, in terms of the public administration community, there is a recognition. In JoinUp, we have 30% of the projects, they use JoinUp, they use EUPL. EUPL is also referred in national registration, such as the Spanish directive or Royal Decree or the Maltese directive. And at last, what are the future plans? We would like to reinforce the legal tools. We want to update the EUPL. It was finalized, I think, in 2009. And for example, the compatibility list is it does not reflect the changes. So we'd like to add additional licenses to the compatibility list. We'd like to prepare contributors' agreements, which can be used on JoinUp. We'd like to further improve JoinUp. I already mentioned the enhanced federation of open source. Now we're working on this one. We'd like to include a machine-translated content and add some more features. And we're also working on a sharing and reuse strategy on a European level. Just a couple of sentences about it. So we'd like to facilitate the reuse and sharing on all levels. The action already started. We're thinking about not only the technical level, so not only the application level, but also how to reuse and share semantic, organizational information, best practices, and legal information. We'd like to think about how we could create new incentives to reuse and share. The problem currently is that sharing is an afterthought. So in public administrations, we have some member states where there's a legislation which requires them to share their work. But it's a burden. The benefit is only long-term, so people just share it. There's no short-term benefit from it. So we'd like to think about how we could create some incentive to better share and use open source. And we would also like to think about what are the actions that we would like to take to facilitate this sharing. So whether we need any legal tools or promotional tools, any new kind of governments on a European level. Thank you very much.